On the morning of April 18, 1987, 3 flatbed trucks rolled through the eastern edge of Linn County, Iowa, carrying what everyone else considered garbage. They rumbled past freshly planted cornfields, crossed the old Cedar River Bridge, and stopped beside an abandoned vegetable packing shed just outside the tiny farming community of Mount Vernon. The trucks tipped their beds one after another. Thousands of broken wooden produce crates crashed into the muddy lot like an avalanche. Splintered oak, cracked pine slats, bent steel straps, rusted nails. By noon, the pile stood nearly 16 feet high. The factory manager signed a single receipt. The drivers climbed back into their cabs. And they left. Standing beside that mountain of broken wood was Margaret Hale, 36 years old, widowed for almost 4 years, raising 2 children on 83 inherited acres that barely paid the property taxes. She didn't flinch. She simply watched. Then she smiled. Nobody understood why. Not the truck drivers. Not the neighbors slowing down along County Road X20. And certainly not Harold Benton, vice president of Cedar Valley Produce Packaging, who had personally approved dumping every last crate there because hauling them to the county landfill would have cost the company nearly $27,000. To Harold, they were worthless. To Margaret, they looked like the beginning of something. Let me tell you about Margaret Hale. She had never planned to become a farmer. She grew up in Cedar Rapids, worked weekends in a hardware store, and married Daniel Hale, a quiet man whose family had cultivated vegetables in Linn County since returning from World War II. Daniel wasn't wealthy. Neither was the farm. But together they made enough selling tomatoes, peppers, sweet corn, and pumpkins through local roadside markets. Everything changed on September 11, 1983. Daniel suffered a fatal heart attack while repairing the hydraulic lift on their aging wagon. He was only 42 years old. The bank expected Margaret to sell. Most neighbors expected the same. Instead, she buried her husband on a windy Thursday afternoon, returned home before sunset, changed into work boots still stained with garden soil, and harvested the remaining rows of peppers by lantern light. Some people mistook quiet for weakness. Margaret never corrected them. She simply kept working. The only machine Daniel had left behind was a 1949 Farmall M, purchased new by his father in November 1949 from an international harvester dealer in Cedar Rapids for $1,487. The tractor produced approximately 38 horsepower from its 4-cylinder engine and weighed just over 5,300 pounds without ballast. By modern standards, it was outdated. Its faded red paint had turned almost brown. The seat springs squeaked. The clutch pedal showed decades of polished steel where boots had worn away the paint. But every Saturday morning Margaret checked the engine oil herself. Every autumn she changed every fluid. Every winter she greased each fitting by hand. The Farmall never complained. Neither did she. By 1987, however, the farm faced another problem. Vegetable prices had fallen. Fuel costs had climbed. Interest rates remained painfully high after the farm crisis that had devastated much of the Midwest earlier in the decade. Margaret needed another source of income. She just hadn't found it yet. Until the crates arrived. Word spread quickly through Linn County. Factory dumped their junk on the widow's place. People stopped to stare. Teenagers climbed the pile after school. Someone even nailed a crooked sign onto the stack that read, "Free firewood." Margaret removed the sign before sunset. Not because she was angry. Because she had different plans. 3 days later, Harold Benton drove out to inspect the site. He wore polished loafers that immediately sank into the muddy gravel. He frowned at the crates. Then at Margaret. "You planning to burn all this?" "No." "Sell it?" "No." He looked genuinely confused. "What exactly are you going to do with it?" Margaret brushed sawdust from her gloves. "I'm still listening." Harold laughed politely. "You can't listen to broken wood." She looked toward the enormous pile. "I think you can." Harold shook his head. "You know what I hear." She waited. "I hear termites." He smiled at his own joke. Margaret smiled too. Neither said another word. By the following week, she had borrowed an old trailer from her neighbor Walter Green, sharpened every handsaw she owned, and parked the Farmall M beside the mountain of crates. Every morning at 6. Every evening until dark. She dismantled them. Not smashed. Not chopped. Carefully. One board at a time. Each usable plank went into one stack. Corner braces into another. Steel straps into barrels. Rusted nails into buckets. Nothing useful was wasted. The neighbors couldn't understand it. They counted nearly 8,400 damaged crates delivered over 4 days. Even if half the wood could be saved, the work would take months. Margaret never hurried. She believed hurried hands made expensive mistakes. By early May, another visitor arrived. Greg Lawson, 31 years old. Regional Agricultural Lending Officer. Fresh business degree. New pickup truck. Pressed shirt. Perfect confidence. The county bank had assigned him to review struggling farms before renewing operating loans. Margaret's farm sat high on his list. Greg walked around the property with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. He noted peeling paint, old fencing, weathered barns, an aging tractor. Then he saw Margaret sorting broken crate boards. He actually stopped writing. "What are you building?" "I haven't started building yet." He frowned. "Then why are you taking them apart?" "So they'll fit." "Fit what?" "You'll see." Greg looked around the yard. "I don't see anything." Margaret nodded. "Exactly." He scribbled another note. From his perspective, everything about the farm confirmed the numbers on his paperwork. Declining revenue. Old equipment. No expansion. No obvious business plan. Just a widow spending hundreds of hours taking apart trash. The following Saturday, several local farmers gathered outside Miller's feed store in Mount Vernon. Coffee steamed from foam cups. Rain clouds drifted overhead. Greg happened to be there. So did Harold Benton. Someone asked how the Hale farm was doing. Greg chuckled before answering. Harold joined in. Soon half the group was laughing. "Lumber Queen," one man joked. "She's opening the world's smallest junkyard," another added. Even Harold slapped his knee. "You should have seen her," he said loudly. Standing there like those busted crates were stacks of gold. The laughter rolled across the parking lot. At that exact moment, Margaret pulled into the feed store, driving the old Farmall M with an empty trailer behind it. The engine settled into its slow, familiar rumble. Every conversation stopped. Harold smiled. Then laughed again. Only louder this time. And everyone else followed. The laughter echoed across the gravel parking lot long after the Farmall M rolled to a stop. Margaret climbed down slowly. Not embarrassed. Not angry. She brushed a little dust from her denim jacket, adjusted one worn leather glove, and walked toward the feed counter as though she hadn't heard a single word. Harold Benton folded his arms. Greg Lawson smirked. One of the younger farmers nudged another with his elbow. "Better ask her if she's selling firewood." More laughter. Margaret picked up 2 sacks of clover seed, a box of galvanized screws, and a replacement bearing for the Farmall's hay wagon. She placed them on the counter. Harold couldn't resist. "So, Margaret," he called across the store, loud enough for everyone to hear, "how many broken boxes does it take to build a fortune?" The room grew quiet. Every eye settled on her. She turned. Her weathered hands rested lightly on the feed counter. "I don't know." Harold grinned. "Thought you had a plan." "I do." "Then tell us." Margaret smiled, calm as ever. "I'd rather show you." Someone chuckled. Harold laughed again, this time throwing his head back. It wasn't a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of someone completely certain he already knew the ending. Greg joined him. Even the cashier smiled awkwardly. Margaret simply paid for her supplies, thanked the cashier, climbed back onto the old Farmall M, and drove away without another word. The steady rhythm of the 4-cylinder engine slowly drowned out the laughter behind her. "Let me tell you about that tractor." The 1949 Farmall M had already lived 3 working lives before Margaret became its caretaker. Daniel's father, Samuel Hale, bought it new in November 1949 after harvesting one of the best corn crops the family had ever seen. He traded in 2 draft horses and nearly every dollar he had saved after the war. Neighbors called him reckless. The Farmall changed everything. It plowed more acres in one day than the horses could manage in 3. It pulled wagons loaded with sweet corn, cultivated vegetable rows, powered a belt-driven grain grinder, and even ran a water pump during drought years. Every dent carried a memory. The scrape along the left fender came from a narrow gate in 1956. The chipped steering wheel happened during the tornado cleanup of May 1968. The polished clutch pedal had been worn smooth by 3 generations of Hale boots. Machines like that weren't simply owned. They were inherited. Back at the farm, Margaret continued dismantling crates from sunrise until dusk. She wasn't collecting lumber. She was sorting dimensions. 24-inch slats, 30-inch side rails, corner blocks, steel hinges. Every piece went into carefully measured piles. By Memorial Day, the mountain looked noticeably smaller. The neighbors assumed she had finally started burning it. She hadn't burned a single board. One afternoon, her 12-year-old daughter Emily walked beside her carrying a notebook. "Mom." "Yes." "How do you remember where everything goes?" Margaret smiled. "I don't." Emily looked confused. "I write it down." She opened the notebook. Every stack had a number. Every board had a measurement. Every usable piece had a future purpose. Nothing was random. Everything belonged somewhere. Have you ever owned something everyone else called worthless? Not because it truly lacked value, but because nobody else had the patience to see what it could become. Sometimes the difference between junk and opportunity isn't the object itself. It's the person looking at it. By early June, Margaret borrowed an old radial arm saw from Walter Green. The motor screamed louder than it cut. She rebuilt the fence around the work area using reclaimed posts. She built measuring tables from salvaged beams. Then, for the first time, the stacks of wood began disappearing almost as quickly as she dismantled them. Nobody knew where they were going. Greg Lawson noticed something unusual during his monthly loan inspection. There were tire tracks. Lots of them. Not tractor tracks. Pickup trucks. Small trailers. Cars from towns outside Linn County. He checked his paperwork. The farm still reported almost no crop income. Yet visitors kept arriving. He knocked on Margaret's back door. She answered wearing safety glasses covered with sawdust. "I won't keep you long," Greg said. "What can I help you with?" "I've seen people coming here." "Yes." "What are they buying?" Margaret looked toward the old packing shed. "They're ordering." "Ordering what?" "You'll know soon." Greg sighed. "You really enjoy speaking in riddles." "No. I don't understand you." "You don't have to." Greg left more puzzled than when he arrived. That same evening, Harold Benton attended a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Cedar Rapids. During casual conversation, someone mentioned hearing about increased weekend traffic near the Hale property. Harold laughed. "I dumped almost 9,000 broken crates there." "Why?" "Cheapest place to leave them." "What if she's selling the wood?" Harold shook his head. "You've never seen those crates. They were garbage." Another businessman raised an eyebrow. "Still, people don't usually drive 30 miles to buy garbage." For the first time in weeks, Harold stopped smiling. The following Saturday morning, he drove back to the farm. This time he parked outside the old vegetable shed instead of beside the crate pile. The mountain was nearly gone. In its place stood rows of neatly stacked lumber sorted with military precision. Harold frowned. He stepped closer. Every board had been trimmed. Every nail removed. Every edge sanded. Inside the shed he heard hammers, saws, voices. He pushed the door open. Then froze. 6 local women worked around long tables assembling beautifully crafted raised garden bed kits. Each kit contained perfectly matched boards, pre-drilled holes, galvanized hardware, simple printed instructions. Children stacked finished boxes near the loading door. Emily sealed each package with twine. Margaret looked up. "Morning, Harold." He stared. "What is all this?" "The crates." "No." He shook his head. "I mean this." Margaret picked up one finished kit. "People in Cedar Rapids want to grow vegetables." "So, most don't own farms." She placed the box into a customer's pickup. They own backyards. Another truck pulled in. Then another. Each driver carried a receipt. Each order had already been paid. Harold looked around. Who's buying these? Margaret answered simply. Families. One customer smiled. We've been waiting 6 weeks. Another laughed. My wife wanted 2. A third leaned out his truck window. If you make larger ones next month, put us on the list. Harold blinked. The list? Margaret nodded. We're booked through August. His expression changed. Slowly, quietly, the confidence that had carried him for months began slipping away. He looked toward the shrinking stacks of reclaimed lumber, then toward the line of waiting customers stretching down the gravel lane. And for the first time since those trucks dumped their load in April, Harold realized the most valuable thing the factory had thrown away had never been the wood. It was the opportunity he had been too certain to see. Harold stood beside his pickup long after the last customer pulled away. The gravel lane became quiet again. Only the steady tapping of hammers drifted from the old packing shed. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then he walked back inside. Margaret was tightening the final screw on another raised garden bed. Emily checked measurements while her younger son, Caleb, stacked bundles of reclaimed boards against the wall. Harold cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. Margaret looked up. For what? For laughing. She smiled gently. You weren't the only one. No. I suppose I wasn't. Harold studied the neat rows of finished kits. I really thought you were wasting your time. I know. You never got angry. There wasn't much point. He nodded slowly. No. There wasn't. Before leaving, Harold asked one more question. How many have you sold? Margaret reached for her order ledger. As of this morning, 486. Harold blinked. Already. And another 217 people are waiting. He looked at the pages again to make sure he had heard correctly. Every order included a customer's name, address, deposit paid, delivery date. Some buyers came from Cedar Rapids. Others drove from Iowa City. A few even came from Dubuque. The waiting list stretched across 7 handwritten pages. Harold walked back to his truck in complete silence. The woman he had laughed at in front of an entire feed store now had more customers than his own factory's seasonal landscaping division. That realization stayed with him all weekend. On Monday morning, he requested copies of the factory's disposal records. Over the previous 5 years, Cedar Valley Produce Packaging had discarded nearly 61,000 wooden produce crates. Most had gone straight to landfills. The disposal fees alone totaled more than $186,000. Harold stared at the numbers. He couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. She hadn't seen trash. She had seen inventory. Let me tell you about old crate lumber. Most produce factories during the 1960s and 1970s used hardwood slats because they had to survive repeated loading, moisture, and rough transportation. Oak and ash were common because they resisted splitting far better than cheap pine. Even damaged crates often contained 70 to 80% usable wood. Pull the nails carefully, trim cracked ends, and suddenly you have seasoned lumber that has already finished shrinking over years of use. That makes it remarkably stable for outdoor projects. Modern pallet wood often twists after cutting. Properly reclaimed crate lumber usually doesn't. Farmers knew that. Manufacturers often forgot. That was exactly what Margaret understood. She wasn't recycling. She was recovering quality that someone else had already paid to produce. By July 1987, the old packing shed had transformed completely. The broken windows were repaired. Workbench after workbench filled the building. Walter Green volunteered every Tuesday. 3 retired carpenters from Mount Vernon offered to help on weekends. Local high school students earned summer wages sanding boards and packing hardware. Nobody called it the junkyard anymore. People started calling it Hale Garden Works. Greg Lawson returned during his quarterly loan review carrying the same clipboard. Only this time, nothing looked familiar. Customers filled the parking area. A delivery truck waited beside the loading dock. Fresh stacks of reclaimed lumber lined the shed. He found Margaret checking measurements with a framing square. "I think I owe you an apology too," he admitted. She smiled. "It seems to be a popular sentence lately." Greg laughed quietly. "I deserved that." He closed his clipboard. "I recommended the bank deny your expansion loan." "I know. I thought your business plan didn't exist." "It didn't." He looked surprised. "I built it afterward." Greg shook his head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this." Margaret handed him a finished planter box. "Most people don't." He turned it over in his hands. "Perfect joints. Clean edges. Solid construction. No warped boards. They've already done all their shrinking." "You planned that." "I counted on it." Greg smiled. "You really were listening to the wood." Margaret laughed softly. "I told you." Have you ever known you were right while everyone around you insisted you were wrong? Not because you had better luck. Because you had quietly done the work they never noticed. Those moments rarely feel satisfying at first. Mostly, they feel lonely. Until the results begin speaking louder than explanations ever could. By August, the waiting list reached nearly 9 months. Local newspapers noticed. The Cedar Rapids Gazette ran a weekend feature about a widow turning factory waste into handcrafted garden products. Orders doubled within 2 weeks. Phone calls arrived faster than Margaret could answer them. Emily started keeping a second ledger just for future customers. One afternoon, a representative from a chain of home improvement stores visited the farm. He admired the products, then made an offer. "We'd like 5,000 units a year." Margaret thanked him, then politely declined. Walter nearly dropped his hammer. After the visitor left, he stared at her. "Margaret, that was the biggest order you've ever seen." "I know. So why refuse it?" She looked around the shed. "What happens if I spend every day chasing one customer?" Walter thought for a moment. "You lose everyone else." She nodded. "And I'd stop building a community." Late that September, Harold returned again. Only this time, he wasn't wearing polished loafers. He wore old work boots. He carried rolled-up factory blueprints beneath one arm. "I have a proposal," he said. Margaret invited him inside. He spread the drawings across the workbench. "Our company is replacing another warehouse next spring." She listened. "We'll have thousands more damaged crates." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I remember." Harold smiled. "This time." He paused. "I'd like to sell them to you instead of paying someone to dump them." Margaret studied the plans. "What price?" Harold named a figure far below market lumber value. She looked at him carefully. "You've changed." "I hope so." "I laughed because I thought experience belonged to people with newer buildings and bigger offices." He glanced around the workshop. "I was wrong." Margaret extended her hand. He shook it firmly. The deal was made. Neither realized someone had been standing quietly outside the open shed door. Greg Lawson had heard every word. And what he decided to do the very next morning would change far more than Margaret's farm. It would reshape how an entire county viewed forgotten things. The next morning, October 2nd, 1987, Greg Lawson arrived at the Linn County Bank before anyone else. The building was still quiet. The lobby lights had not yet been switched on. He carried Margaret Hale's loan file under one arm and a yellow legal pad under the other. For almost an hour, he rewrote every recommendation he had made about her farm. 3 months earlier, he had described the operation as high risk, limited growth potential, aging equipment, insufficient collateral. Now he crossed out every line. In its place, he wrote something entirely different. Demonstrated profitability through innovative material recovery. Proven customer demand exceeding current production capacity. Recommend immediate approval for expansion financing. When the senior loan committee met later that morning, Greg did something few bankers enjoy doing. He admitted he had been wrong. Not partially wrong. Completely wrong. One committee member asked, "What changed?" Greg smiled. "I finally stopped looking at her balance sheet." "What did you start looking at?" "The waiting list." The loan was approved unanimously. Margaret never celebrated. She simply drove the old 1949 Farmall M home from town, parked it beside the packing shed, and went back to work before lunch. That was who she was. The expansion happened slowly, exactly the way she preferred. She never built a giant factory. She never chased national retailers. Instead, she added another workshop beside the original shed, hired 6 more local workers, and trained every one of them the same way Daniel had once taught her. Measure twice. Waste nothing. Leave every board better than you found it. By the spring of 1988, Hale Garden Works employed 14 people from Linn County. Some were retired farmers. Some were young parents looking for flexible hours. One was a Vietnam veteran who hadn't held steady work in nearly 5 years. Margaret never asked for impressive resumes. She looked at hands. Hands that wanted honest work. The waiting list remained. Sometimes 4 months. Sometimes nearly a year. Customers didn't seem to mind. They weren't buying inexpensive garden beds. They were buying something built with patience. And people could feel the difference. Let me tell you about Harold Benton. Most stories would have ended with him walking away embarrassed. Life rarely works that way. Over the following years, Harold completely redesigned Cedar Valley Produce Packaging's disposal system. Instead of paying landfill fees, the factory partnered with local schools, woodworking clubs, family farms, and small businesses to reclaim damaged crates. Waste dropped dramatically. Operating costs fell. Other produce companies copied the idea. Whenever someone praised Harold for the innovation, he always corrected them. "It wasn't my idea." "Whose was it?" "A widow with an old tractor." He never failed to say her name. Margaret Hale. That mattered to him. Greg Lawson changed too. He became known throughout eastern Iowa as the banker who spent more time walking farms than reading reports. When younger loan officers asked why he always insisted on visiting every property personally, he answered with the same sentence. "Paper tells you what happened. The land tells you what's about to happen." Years later, many of those younger bankers repeated his advice without realizing where it had come from. The old Farmall M continued working through every season. Its engine still carried the familiar slow rhythm that Daniel loved. Every winter Margaret drained the coolant. Every spring she adjusted the valves. Every autumn she greased every fitting until fresh grease pushed through the bearings. Visitors often asked why she didn't replace it with something newer. She would rest one hand on the faded hood. "This one still remembers the farm." Around 1996, a collector offered $18,500 for the tractor. It was beautifully restored by then, though Margaret had insisted the dents remain. He couldn't understand why. "They lower the value." Margaret smiled. "No. They explain it." The tractor never left the farm. Its faded red paint carried 47 harvests. Its worn seat had held 3 generations. Its engine had never forgotten how to work. In 2001, Emily returned after earning a business degree from Iowa State University. People assumed she would modernize everything. Instead, she expanded carefully. An order system was added. Then mail catalogs. Years later, a simple website. The waiting list remained. Not because production stayed slow. Because quality never became negotiable. Margaret often told new employees something they never forgot. Fast work fills trucks. Careful work fills calendars. By 2008, nearly every broken crate from Cedar Valley Produce Packaging found a second life before reaching a landfill. Schools used the lumber. Community gardens used it. Families built backyard vegetable beds across Iowa. Thousands of people grew tomatoes, peppers, beans, and herbs inside wood that had once been dismissed as worthless. Margaret rarely spoke at public events. She declined most interviews. She preferred working beside her employees. Visitors usually found her sweeping the floor or tightening loose bolts on old equipment rather than standing behind a podium. On an unusually warm afternoon in October 2014, Margaret parked the Farmall M inside the original packing shed after finishing the fall cleanup. She shut off the engine. The familiar rumble faded into silence. She rested her hand on the steering wheel for a long moment. Then she walked toward the house where Emily and her grandchildren were preparing supper. She passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, at the age of 63. The funeral filled the little church outside Mount Vernon. Farmers, teachers, factory workers, bankers, customers, children who had grown vegetables in her handcrafted garden beds years earlier. Even Harold Benton stood quietly near the back, holding his hat against his chest. Nobody remembered the day he laughed. They remembered the day he learned. Today, the Farmall M still starts on the first or second pull of the starter rod. It appears every autumn during the local harvest festival, driven by one of Margaret's grandchildren. The dents remain. The paint remains faded. The engine still sounds exactly the way Daniel remembered. And the original order ledger, the one Emily carried as a 12-year-old while her mother sorted broken crate boards, is displayed inside the workshop office, open to the first page. Customer number 1. Paid in full. Delivered on time. Some things become valuable only after someone refuses to believe everyone else's definition of worthless. If you've ever watched someone quietly build a life from what others threw away, or if you've ever inherited an old machine, a family tool, or a piece of land that carried more memories than money, I hope you'll share that story in the comments. Those are the stories that deserve to be remembered. And if you'd like to hear about the elderly farmer in Story County, Iowa, who rescued a forgotten 1952 John Deere Model 40 from a collapsed barn and uncovered a decades-old promise hidden beneath its seat, I'd be honored to tell you that story next.